It was supposed to be over in a few months, home by Christmas, they said. But instead, the Great War became a nightmare that swallowed millions of lives. Beneath the smoke, beneath the artillery fire, beneath the endless rain, lay the trenches, long, muddy graves that stretched across Europe. This is the untold truth of what really happened in the trenches of World War I. 1. The Western Front, a line that never moved. By late 1914, the optimism of war had died. After the early German advances were stopped at the Marne, both sides dug in. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, a vast network of trenches carved through the earth, nearly 500 miles long. It wasn't strategy anymore. It was survival. Each army built 3 main lines: the front trench, the support trench, and the reserve line, connected by zigzagging communication trenches. Between them lay the most terrifying place on earth, no man's land. A wasteland of mud, craters, shattered trees, and corpses, sometimes only 100 yards wide. 2. Life in the mud. The trenches were not fortresses. They were filthy, wet ditches filled with misery. Soldiers stood in ankle-deep, sometimes knee-deep mud for weeks. Rain turned the ground into a swamp. Trench walls were made of sandbags and wooden planks, but they collapsed constantly. In winter, the cold froze everything, even rifles. In summer, the stench was unbearable. The smell of death hung over everything. The rot of bodies buried in the walls, unwashed uniforms, human waste, and smoke from constant shell fire. Many soldiers went weeks without changing clothes. Lice crawled through every layer of fabric, biting and spreading disease. Trench fever, a painful condition caused by lice, sent thousands to hospitals. And then there was the mud. When the ground was soaked with rain and blood, it could swallow a man whole. Horses, carts, and even tanks were lost to the sludge. 3. The daily routine of survival. Despite the horror, trench life followed a grim routine. Before dawn came stand to. Every man took his position, rifle ready in case of an enemy attack at sunrise. After that came breakfast, usually cold tea, stale bread, and bully beef, a type of canned corned beef. During the day, soldiers repaired sandbags, reinforced walls, drained water, or filled shell holes. Some cleaned their rifles or wrote letters home. At night, they became shadows. Under the cover of darkness, patrols crawled into no man's land to repair barbed wire or listen for enemy activity. Sometimes, small raiding parties struck silently, killing or capturing prisoners. Sleep came in short, restless bursts. The constant artillery fire meant silence was rare. Even rest was a luxury bought with fear. 4. The weapons and the whistle. When the whistle blew, men knew what it meant, the order to go over the top. They climbed out of the trenches and charged across no man's land into machine gun fire. The average life expectancy of a soldier attacking across open ground was sometimes less than 1 minute. Machine guns like the German MG-08 could fire 600 bullets per minute, mowing down waves of soldiers before they got halfway. Artillery was even deadlier. Over 60% of all deaths in WWI came from shells. Massive guns launched high-explosive rounds that shattered trenches and buried men alive. Gas attacks added another layer of horror. Chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas burned lungs and skin. Soldiers scrambled for their gas masks, sometimes too late. One British soldier described it simply, "Your lungs were turned inside out." 5. the psychological war. But even those who survived weren't truly safe. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, was rampant. The unending shell fire, the screams, the death, it broke men's minds. Some shook uncontrollably. Others went blind without any physical injury. Many couldn't speak at all. At the time, commanders dismissed it as cowardice. Some victims were even executed for desertion or refusal to fight. Yet they weren't cowards. They were casualties of a war the human mind wasn't built to endure. 6. The dead and the living. In the trenches, death was a neighbor. Bodies often lay just a few feet away, sometimes buried in the trench walls to save time. Soldiers joked about it, sang songs, tried to forget, but the sight and smell never left. Rats the size of cats fed on corpses, growing fat and fearless. Soldiers shot them for sport, but there were always more. Funerals were brief, sometimes just a few whispered words before another shell landed. For the living, the hardest part wasn't dying. It was staying alive, day after day, knowing death was coming sooner or later. 7. The Christmas Truce. Yet, even in hell, humanity flickered. On Christmas Eve 1914, something miraculous happened. Across parts of the Western Front, soldiers from both sides laid down their weapons. British and German troops climbed out of their trenches, shook hands, and shared gifts. They sang carols, exchanged chocolate and cigarettes, even played football in the snow. For one brief night, the war stopped. Letters from soldiers described it as a moment of peace among madness. But commanders soon forbade such truces. The war machine had no room for mercy. The next day, the guns roared again. 8. The war machine grinds on. By 1916, trench warfare reached its deadliest peak. Two battles defined the horror: Verdun and the Somme. At Verdun, the French and Germans fought for 10 brutal months with over 700,000 casualties. The motto of the French army was, "They shall not pass." At the Somme, British forces launched a massive offensive. On the first day alone, 19,000 men were killed, making it the bloodiest day in British military history. Despite the slaughter, the front lines barely moved. Every yard gained was paid for in thousands of lives. 9. Adaptation and Innovation. As the war dragged on, both sides adapted. New weapons appeared: flamethrowers, tanks, and airplanes. The British Mark I tank, introduced in 1916, crawled across the mud, crushing barbed wire and terrifying defenders. Though slow and unreliable, it symbolized a shift in warfare. Airplanes, once used for scouting, began dropping bombs and engaging in dogfights. Communications improved too. Runners, telephones, and even carrier pigeons helped coordinate attacks. Yet for all this progress, the trenches remained the same: cold, filthy, and deadly. Technology evolved, but the human suffering stayed constant. 10. The human side. Letters from the trenches. Amid all this chaos, soldiers tried to hold on to their humanity. They wrote letters, thousands of them, home to mothers, wives, and children. One British private wrote, "We live in mud and rats, but we fight for the day we can see blue skies again." Another German soldier confessed, "When the shells fall, I think of home, and I wonder if this world will ever be the same." These letters, filled with love and despair, are now treasured relics of a generation that lived through hell. They remind us that behind every uniform was a person, scared, homesick, and trying to survive. 11. The end of the trenches. By 1918, after 4 years of endless bloodshed, the tide turned. The U.S. entered the war, bringing fresh troops and supplies. The German army, starving and exhausted, began to crumble. The Allies broke through the Hindenburg Line, the last German defensive network. The trenches that once seemed eternal were finally abandoned. On November 11, 1918, the guns fell silent. But the silence came too late. Over 17 million people were dead, and much of Europe lay in ruins. 12. Aftermath: the wounds that never healed. When the soldiers returned home, many were unrecognizable, not by their faces, but by their eyes. The war had changed them. The memories of mud, gas, and death haunted them forever. Entire towns were wiped out. Cemeteries stretched for miles, filled with white crosses. And though the war ended, the peace that followed was fragile. The unresolved anger and economic ruin would one day spark an even greater catastrophe: World War II. 13. What the trenches taught us. The trenches were not just a battlefield. They were a lesson. They showed what happens when industrial power meets human flesh, when pride and politics outweigh human life. They taught the world the limits of endurance and the cost of modern warfare. Every inch of no man's land, every letter written in the dark, every life lost in the mud is a reminder of how fragile civilization truly is. 14. The final reflection. The men who lived and died in those trenches were not heroes or villains. They were ordinary people caught in extraordinary madness. They endured rain, rats, and fire. They watched friends vanish before their eyes. Yet they kept going, not for glory, but for each other. What really happened in the trenches of World War I was not just a story of war. It was the story of humanity itself, its courage, its suffering, and its will to survive even in the darkest of times.